Hello, and it's great to be with you, albeit virtually. I've given the title for myself today of Assessment for Digital Learning, Two Provocations, and I'm going to outline two propositions, one related to assessment and the other related to feedback. I've put on the slide my Twitter handle. That could be one of the avenues for us to discuss further as we move on. So in terms of an overview, I'm going to suggest that we might expand digital oral forms of assessment, and I'm going to outline why I think now is a particular good time to expand this form of assessment. Secondly, I'm always very aware in the feedback space that we need to use teachers' valuable time in effective ways. I never want to recommend feedback practices that are going to be more time-consuming for teachers. So therefore, I'm going to argue that we might consider curtailing or even abandoning individual summative written commentary as a form of feedback at the end of semester, because it doesn't lead to student action and is therefore relatively redundant. So for these two issues, I'm going to try to outline the rationales, some challenges, and some implications. Okay, so firstly, digital oral assessment designs. I'm going to suggest that we should make oral forms of assessment a more central part of our digital assessment designs. Now, I think this idea is particularly suitable for Australia. I guess over the last 20 to 25 years, I've probably been to Australia at least 20 times. I've probably visited at least a dozen different universities. And I must say, I'm very impressed by your oral skills. You guys really have the gift of the gab. Maybe there are other places where writing is even stronger, other places where maybe the teachers are even more diligent. But I think for Australians, oracy is something you clearly do very well in your school system. And I think in assessment, we should play to students' strengths. And I think we should be trying to design assessment that can bring out the best in students. So I think oral assessment is a very promising starting point. Now, oral assessment has been with us, I think, since around the mid to late 1990s. So why at this particular point in time am I suggesting that digital forms of oral assessment could be powerful and part of our core assessment designs? I want to take us back 18 months or so to the early stages of the pandemic. I'm based in the University of Hong Kong, and you may know that our quarantine rules and our restrictions around COVID were fairly harsh. University of Hong Kong is a fairly traditional research-intensive university. We always have quite a lot of exams at the end of semester. But because of COVID, we couldn't do the traditional sit-down exams. So our colleagues put their heads together, and our Vice President for Teaching and Learning suggested that an alternative to end-of-semester exams that were no longer possible could be oral assessment. And part of the rationale was, if you think marking an exam takes around 10 to 15 minutes, it could be workload neutral to replace that exam with a 10 to 15 minute oral assessment. In 2021, I was preparing a talk for Imperial College London, specializing in STEM. So I reached out to some of my colleagues in this university and said to them, well, how did this oral assessment emergency strategy work for you? They seemed largely positive. Some of the useful elements was that oral assessment can help to differentiate students' capacities and expertise. With an exam, it's set in advance, so there's no opportunity to adjust during the process. But with oral assessments, The teachers could adjust to students' levels. They could extend the stronger students, or they could support more the less competent performers. So it got me thinking a bit more about oral assessment as a candidate for expansion at this point in time. So I look back into the literature. Oral assessment has been around, obviously, for quite a time. It seems to align well with graduate attributes. We need graduates who can communicate effectively orally. There's also an authenticity to oral assessment in daily life for many different professions. Most professions, indeed, we need effective oral communication. Gordon Jockin from Queensland did a PhD around oral assessment. Generally positive findings. Students like it. Students found it quite a profound learning experience, much more than an exam or a written essay. And they felt that it led to superior learning outcomes. So some potentials there in the last 15 years or so in terms of oral assessment. But what about in our increasingly digital world? So I looked into the literature. I found a recent example of biochemistry lab reports, oral interaction promoting higher order thinking. Higher order thinking, of course, part of the essence of higher education. Interestingly, in oral assessment, there seems to be a dimension of enhanced student accountability. Obviously, students prepare for an exam, but for an oral assessment, you can't just sort of give up. You're actually involved in communication with your interlocutor. So it seemed that students were really eager to do their best in terms of oral assessment. So it seems to me in our digital world, where video is becoming increasingly important and central, that there are promising opportunities for students to record. And by recording, they can practice, they can go through multiple takes, they can do it in their own time. For students to record short podcasts or video presentations, and they can upload them to the learning management system for assessment. Now, how long should be a short presentation? Well, I've suggested 3 minutes there. And I'm thinking of the 3-minute thesis competition that is popular now around the world. If you can summarize a thesis of 75,000 words or so in 3 minutes, why not have 3 minutes as an oral presentation? I'm also thinking that the shorter length could be productive for teacher workload of marking. And as I said at the outset, I'm always very keen to think of strategies that are not going to increase teacher marking workload. But if you think 3 minutes is too short, it could be 5 minutes. But in my opinion, 10 minutes is too long. So I like the shorter, snappier form of communication, because I think the ability to articulate thoughts concisely is a very important skill that we should be developing in our students. Another format it could take is vlogs. These could be regular, short, personal responses. They could be thinking aloud. They could be developing ideas. They could be constructing arguments. I think assessment often works well when there is some choice and flexibility. And I think vlogging can bring in some of that potential choice and flexibility for students to talk about the topics that have meaning for them. To me, one of the powers of digital oral assessment is I think it is authentic to students' lives and current worlds. We know our students spend a lot of time on YouTube, social media, etc. So I think video presentations, vlogging is attractive to them. I think it's interesting to them. And I think what evidence there is out there, they're quite enjoying doing this kind of assessment, this kind of learning format. I've highlighted YouTube. As I say, I used to travel to Australia pretty frequently. Since the pandemic, not so much. My conference globetrotting has been severely curtailed. But what I do nowadays is I often think of a scholar I'd like to listen to, go to YouTube, put in their name, and listen to them virtually. And I think students use YouTube for leisure, obviously, but also for learning purposes. So I think another assignment possibility could be identifying and curating YouTube learning materials in your subject area or discipline, and there could be an assignment around that kind of element. I know contract cheating is quite an area of concern in Australia in the last few years. As I said at the outset, I quite like engaging in debates on Twitter. Now, I quite like this comment. If you're worried that students are going to cheat on the assignments, then maybe create a better assessment. Phil Dawson tells me that there's a lot more to it than this, but assessment design does seem to me to be part of a means of tackling concerns about cheating and contract cheating. So, drawing the threads to a close for proposition 1, what might be some of the challenges for digital oral assessment? Well, I suppose moderation and fairness, but I think because you have a copy of the recording that this can be tackled. I suppose that different disciplines would be more or less suited to digital oral assessment. Time may be a factor, but I think I've tried to demonstrate that digital oral assessment of short duration can be a useful part of an assessment design. Students always want to know what are the expectations, what are the criteria for good performance, and I think we can use plenty of examples of 3-minute theses or of TED Talks to exemplify what are the features of a good digital presentation. I guess it may appeal to certain students more than others, so maybe bringing in some flexibility, maybe even written blogging as an alternative to vlogging could be part of the equation. So that's my first proposition, an enhanced role for digital oral assessment. But I should acknowledge I haven't done extensive research on oral assessment, but I have read around. But I'm throwing those ideas open for your consideration or rebuttal. The second issue is my main area of specialism, and it's around the challenge of feedback. We know from your SES Student Experience Survey in Australia, we know from the National Student Survey in England and around the world that students generally are not particularly inspired by the feedback regimes they are experiencing at university. In my opinion, one of the main issues is that feedback needs somewhere to land, it needs somewhere to go. So anything that comes at the end of the semester, at the end of a module, at the end of a course, at the end of a unit, is very limited in its potential for traction. So what I'm going to suggest in my provocation 2 is that perhaps we should reduce or maybe even abandon end of semester written commentary. I'm using the term commentary carefully because maybe it isn't even feedback. David Bowd has argued persuasively that it is only feedback if it leads to student sense-making and action. And as I'm going to demonstrate, and as I think you know from your own experience, end of semester written commentary invariably fails to engage with students' hearts and minds because it's too late. The final grade is awarded, not much can be done. I think it's important that we engage with and listen to students' views and experiences of assessment, even if we don't agree with them and even if we have different views. I very much like this student experience of feedback quotation. For this student, feedback seemed like a perversely belated revelation of things that should have been made clear earlier. So this was getting the comment at the end of semester, after the final grade is awarded, now you tell me what you were looking for. Students want to know what teachers are looking for in an assignment. What do I need to do to get a good grade? What do I need to do to succeed in this assignment? So it could even be quite annoying if 3 weeks after the course is finished, then the student finds out what it was the teacher was looking for. So I think they want guidance, and I think they've been fairly clear for rather a long time that they find end of semester feedback relatively blunt and redundant. I did a small-scale longitudinal study with a small group of students a few years ago, and I wondered if the emotional side of feedback being critiqued was one of the challenges. Yes, it was to some extent, but the students seemed pretty clear that they welcomed critical feedback during the flow of the course. So if it was a design assessment task 1, feedback assessment task 2, and that they could use the feedback from task 1 for task 2, then they liked this form of feedback. But any critical feedback at the end, any commentary at the end, was of very little use to them because the final grade is awarded. Again, we may critique students for this attitude, but this is the culture of higher education institutions, that the students need to graduate, they need to get distinctions, etc., for their future competitiveness. My co-author, Naomi Winston, took this photo on a visit to a British university that shall not be named, and it's what Naomi has called feedback graveyards. These end of semester uncollected assignments, it's too late for action, so all the effort of teachers marking has gone to waste. And we have the digital equivalent of that, which is known as check the grade and log out. The students go to the learning management system, there's a grade and there's some comments, but as this student said, you're not going to get any more marks for looking at the feedback. Qualitative comments, also quantitative evidence from Mensick and King. Many students, hundreds of them in this large sample, don't access the feedback on the learning management system. By the end of semester, it's just the grade. So what can we do? Well, Bowd and Malloy very wisely say we should deploy teacher workload wisely, and we should reduce teacher commentary when it cannot be used. And to me, this is part of what I call teacher feedback literacy, the capacities and the expertise to design feedback processes. Feedback needs to be designed. It's not something that will just happen miraculously at the end of a course, and it needs to be designed specifically for student action, for student uptake. And Naomi Winston and myself, we've conceptualized this move from the delivery of comments from teachers to a focus on uptake as a move from an old paradigm of feedback as delivery to a new paradigm of feedback as uptake. So how might we translate these ideas into practical actions? So my proposition is we need to reduce end of semester feedback to make space for other more meaningful learning activities. So I'm suggesting here a 2-sentence end of semester summative commentary template. The first sentence to give an appraisal and some form of grade explanation so that the student understands why they've got the grade they received. So maybe something like, this assignment is a distinction because you covered the core aspects of the question in a reasonably insightful way. Something like that, some appraisal and grade explanation. Then importantly, I think the second sentence should be forward-looking. In future work, you might consider going into a bit more depth about fewer items, but in more depth. So less superficial coverage, going into a bit more depth in the topics that you've covered. You might consider, I think that's quite a nice invitational way of putting it. If we were to develop this kind of summative commentary template, this would bring consistency into our commentary, our feedback, and I think this would be workload friendly for teachers, and it would avoid redundant commentary at the end of semester. So that's one idea. Could be piloted in a department or a faculty, and even possibly expanded to a whole university. It could be used as an alternative or in conjunction with my second suggestion that we could use collective feedback at the end of the semester. How the students have performed, the common errors they've made, and some suggestions for improvement. Now, I'm very aware that collective feedback is a relatively blunt tool and that students tend to assume it doesn't apply to them. But I think in large cohorts, it could be a practical way of providing some kind of closure to a course. Now, my main argument or my main driver for trying to reduce summative commentary is to make space for something more meaningful. Following Di Hounsel, I'm calling this guidance, integrated cycles of guidance and feedback. And I've suggested 4 elements of guidance on this slide, and I'm not going to have the time to go into them in much detail, although each 4 of them are actually quite rich elements in themselves. I've underlined the first one because I think it's a very important one. And going back to the low scores on the Australian SES, the student dissatisfaction with feedback, I think it's because, as Andy Adcroft once said, there is a dissonance, a misalignment between teacher and student views of feedback. And I think we need to reduce this dissonance. We need to talk about feedback as a process with students. We need to listen to them. We need to empathize them even if we disagree with their views. I think one of the best ways of enhancing our feedback practice, of enhancing our feedback literacy, is to put ourselves in students' shoes, to engage more thoroughly with their struggles, their challenges they need in feedback processes. And as an example, Kelly Matthews in UQ has been doing some excellent work, conversations between teachers and students in groups around what feedback is, what it means, what are the challenges, what are the tipping points, how it can be enhanced. So in other words, bringing a students as partners dimension into the feedback processes. Secondly, students often struggle with expectations for an assignment. What is it being looked for? So I think aspects such as co-construction of rubrics, trying to help students understand criteria and standards are very important. Criteria and rubrics are often seen by students as quite abstract. So I think we also need exemplars of different quality, not just one exemplar that could be seen as a model answer, but several ones of different quality. I'm also quite enthusiastic about reversing or flipping the sequence. So not providing the exemplar at the outset, but getting students to produce, for example, an oral presentation or a vlog or a podcast, and then the exemplars become the feedback. So students do something first, then they analyze exemplars. And then fourthly, well-designed audio, video, screencast, peer feedback can also be part of the reflective guidance process. So just drawing things to a conclusion, what are the challenges to this kind of approach to feedback? Well, it is true that students have worked hard on their assignments and they want to feel we've reciprocated their effort. But I think if we communicate with them persuasively, have these conversations, we're going to try and give you more guidance, more support during the process, but there'll be a bit less at the end because it's too late for you to act. In my experience, students are quite sympathetic to that kind of argument. They want the inputs and the guidance before the final grade is awarded. Obviously, it's always difficult in higher education to change the status quo, and you may have other thoughts to challenge what I'm saying. Okay, just in conclusion, what I've tried to do is propose two provocations today. The first one around expanding digital oral assessment, vlogging, podcasts, YouTube, etc., because I feel they are rich and authentic to students' worlds, and they will generate interest and powerful learning outcomes in our students. And secondly, I've argued that feedback at the end of semester is relatively redundant and inert because there are so few prospects for student action. The proof of the feedback pudding is in the action. So therefore, I've argued for increased opportunities for guidance, communicating around feedback, putting ourselves into students' shoes. The references are there. I'd like to acknowledge the Research Grants Council of Hong Kong for supporting my work. And it was a great pleasure to be with you today. And I hope we can continue the dialogue in other formats. Thank you.